Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us for today's virtual workshop with TCDI and Smith Anderson. Thank you for joining us and for tuning in. My name is Emily. I am with NC Tech located here in Charlotte, and we're really excited to be able to offer these virtual workshops with our members. And I'm going to go ahead and waste no time here, but if just for a few housekeeping things, if you have any questions, we're going to use the Q&A feature today. It's at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can go ahead and submit questions there. I'm not sure how our folks today are going to handle those. They'll let you know that here in just a second, but attendees are in listen-only mode, so use that Q&A feature for any questions, and feel free to submit any technical questions about the webinar and your experience to me through the chat feature. So without further ado, big thanks to TCDI and Smith Anderson for sponsoring today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Joe Dickinson.
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joe Dickinson. I'm a partner at Smith Anderson in Raleigh, and I lead our data use, privacy, and security group. And before we get into the more substantive topics, I'd like to give my partners in crime an opportunity to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Eric Vanderberg, Vice President of Cybersecurity at TCDI.
I'm Bogdan Solomaka. I'm the Senior Cybersecurity Engineer at TCDI, and thank you for having us.
Okay, great. Next slide, Eric. And next one. All right, so briefly, this is sort of the agenda we thought we'd talk about today. We want to talk about a few topics: remote work considerations, common cybersecurity attacks, remote incident response, investigations, supporting remote employees, and then we'll hopefully leave with some key takeaways. Generally speaking, one of the things that we're seeing is with the change in the environment that we're all working in, the remote access is really bringing to the forefront some of the issues that we've known were there all along, but they're much more prevalent when we see the significance of the remote access compared to the technology being used at offices and in business facilities. So, Eric, next slide if you would. Oh, we missed one, right? Did we miss one? So before we get into the details, we wanted to talk about remote work considerations. And, by necessity, and I think appropriately, the majority of our conversation will focus on the technical considerations, but it's really important that people remember that from the legal and regulatory perspective, the technical safeguards, the technical issues that you're required to deal with are really just 1/3 of the legal/regulatory stool. The other 2/3 are physical safeguards and administrative safeguards. And it's important to remember that while the technology is such a prevalent part of the ability to interact and is such a prevalent part of the new risks that we're seeing, when things go wrong, it's important to remember that you need to keep track of and manage your physical safeguards, which can be quite challenging given that you've got a number of remote access points that probably weren't part of the everyday life prior to the COVID pandemic. And also remember that the administrative safeguards, right? So the policies and procedures that you've drafted, we see often where those policies and procedures still focus on the primary work facility and not and haven't been updated to address the remote access. And so it's important that since the laws and regulations that apply to you when you're at work apply equally when you're at home, let's not forget about keeping track of and updating those physical and administrative safeguards. Bogdan, are you up to date with what Eric wanted to address with these first couple of slides?
Yeah, I can jump in and add some color here. Maybe not as well as Eric, but we work on a lot of similar projects. So I mean, I think with remote work considerations, we were actually having a little bit of this conversation before we started this webinar with Emily and you, Joe, as how this is becoming a new normal. And that's maybe a little bit of a cliche nowadays. Everyone's saying new normal, unprecedented times, but we are seeing significant upticks in remote workforces. 90% of IT officials believe that remote work is not secure. We have, even though there's significant upticks in remote work, a lot of the people.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, Eric, we can hear you.
All right, good. Don't know what's going on there.
So a lot of the people that work in the IT field, they generally have this consensus that remote work is insecure because there's a lot of factors, and I'm sure a lot of you have already heard those, where home networks aren't as secure. And I can probably ping pong it back to you, Eric, here, and you can regain control.
Yeah, well, we've designed networks for years to support certain working conditions where primarily people were in the office or and with a smaller number working remotely. And now with the pandemic, that's shifted, where primarily people are working remotely, and that's put a lot more burden on these networks, and certainly subjected them to different usage scenarios that have stressed existing systems. Before this, already there was this belief that remote work wasn't as secure as those who were on site, and there weren't necessarily the policies in place to govern exactly how that was going to take place. So it's really caused a lot of stress on these IT departments, on security groups, to put the systems in place to support all of those remote workers, and then to try to do so securely. Some had to modify existing processes, but this 3.4% of the workforce now is the 90% of the workforce, most of those working remotely. And so there's a lot of potential security issues that have to be taken into account.
And, another thing that I think we forget about is, as the remote access has expanded, think about business reputation and what happens when things go wrong. Because, as an example, most people aren't familiar with the physio-mechanical breach, right? And so when you talk about the physio-mechanical breach, you get a lot of sort of blank stares. But if you remind folks that is more commonly known as the target breach, then people are much more familiar. And so as we see an expansion of remote access points, not only for staff and employees, but it's also, remember, to Eric's point, that you need to be aware of the increase in the security or potential security compromises associated with that remote access for customers and for vendors.
Yeah, here we see some of the changes here going from that 3.4%. Now it's much higher, 90% or so, 75 million people here working from home, and up to 30 million expected after everything calms down and we resume that new normal. That whatever you're putting in place now is going to be serving you well in the future. It's not a short-term investment, because remote work is sometimes not going to go away. And so now is the time to really get it right, to figure out what those security controls are going to be, and to put them all in place. So let's look at some of the common cybersecurity attacks and strategies, because there's a lot going on, and there's a lot that can impact the environment, not just the the way it was set up prior to the pandemic, but the remote working environment, and specifically how these attackers are trying to take advantage of these changes in the way we work. And some of these include, first, of course, phishing. Communication is key to running a business and to doing our jobs. And with so many people working remotely, that has become a little bit more difficult. We're not seeing people face to face, and so it can be easier for attackers to leverage some of the phishing attacks, things like business email compromise, where they're attempting to pretend like they're one party in a financial transaction and get you to send money to another source, or data breaches. And also just phishing used to gain a foothold onto a network. Bogdan's going to talk more about some of these, but we're also seeing increased use of malware and ransomware to basically hold a company hijack. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. It looks like my video for
distributed denial of service attacks that are taking systems down. When you're relying on all of these remote access systems and suddenly they become unavailable, now employees can't do work, or you can't service customers. So distributed denial of service is also something that's good, very impactful to companies. Now we'll look at some of the vulnerabilities that are being exploited and the theft of devices.
And one quick thought, Eric, and that is one of the bullet points you had was data breaches. And one of the things that we're seeing a significant increase in are contract terms that go beyond data breaches and address data incidents. And so it's important for business owners and key business leaders to be aware of their contractual obligations, because if something qualifies as a data incident, it might not rise to the level of a data breach, and you might not have regulatory or legal obligations that kick under the appropriate state or federal or international laws, but you might have contractual obligations to make your business partners aware of data incidents, even when they fall short of a data breach.
Yeah, that is a good point. Terminology is important, and we see it a lot where we talk to a company doing incident response, and you have events, and an event may or may not be an incident, and then you get into an incident and the different types of incidents, and one of them may be a data breach, but we don't want to immediately jump in and label something a data breach when it may be an event or an incident. So Bogdan, you want to tell us a little bit more about some of these threats here, especially phishing?
Yeah, I guess I can touch on some of these items. Yeah, so some of the fun stuff when it comes to the attacks, and and the crazy thing is that we've heard the term phishing a number of times. I mean, we just don't stop hearing about it, and the reason why we don't stop hearing about it because it's an ongoing threat, even in light of all the technical controls that organizations put into place, and email filters, and all the technical solutions, even employee training and stuff like that. Phishing is still very prevalent. Fishers, the fishers, they're fishermen, fisherwomen. They're becoming very smart, very calculated. Their attacks are very orchestrated. They know who to target. They know where to find the resources and information they need to be able to target and perform spear phishing. And phishing really is a gateway. Phishing isn't necessarily the stop of the attack. It's really just a means of gaining a foothold, like Eric mentioned earlier, and usually it leads to data exfiltration. In some cases, it'll lead to the infection of the internal network with viruses, spyware, scams, or other fraudulent schemes. We've also seen that phishing attacks, they're really designed to try to harvest information from you and from your colleagues and from your family, because phishing is really a means of the same way that affiliate marketing companies or other marketing companies, the way they scrape information off the internet, the way they scrape information off LinkedIn and Google and all that type of stuff. The malicious attackers use a lot of the same methods. They use a lot of the same tools to be able to then create profiles on their intended targets. And really with phishing, you want to be aware that they exist. And I think a good example to this is something like, for example, for me, if I were to go buy a used car, I know what to look for, because, maybe I've been taught some things from my dad on, what to look for when you're purchasing a car. Whereas if I was told by my wife to go and buy her a purse or something like that, or some shoes, I don't know what to look for unless she tells me what to look for. So when it comes to phishing, you want to definitely, be proactive in learning how to identify phishing, so you know what to look for. That way you're not just either making assumptions, either that it's clean or safe, but you know what to look for in these certain phishing circumstances, because they come in all the time. Next slide.
Quick question, Bogdan. When we think about the significant increase in remote access that's happening today, should organizations do anything differently, or are there things that they should be aware of with respect to the defenses that they've put in place? Because that technology might protect them when people are working in the office, but may need some fine tuning or may need some enhancement to protect people working from home. And is it also not a concern that when people are working at home, that if there is an attack, not only could it compromise the business systems, but in fact, it could compromise their home networks? I think we're seeing some examples where senior leaders are working from home and they're the target of an attack, and the encryption, the ransomware, doesn't discriminate. And we're seeing executives who have home networks with 20 years of family photos that are now encrypted and lost.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when you have more remote workers, you definitely want to, I think, provide more training. I think it's something that I've learned as working with a lot of clients, boots on the ground and incident response scenarios, is that it's always a lack of training. It's always the inability of an individual to be able to identify an immediate threat that's sitting in their mailbox, or that's even been sitting there for months. But yeah, that's a very good point to bring up, Joe. So, phishing typically leads to a BEC or a business email compromise, and the business email compromise is really just, in most cases we've seen, it's a means of making some money for the malicious attackers. So they're really targeting CFOs, CEOs. They're spear phishing people that have a little bit more leverage within an organization, and they typically use a few methods, and they use methods of, hey, this needs to be done now. This is critical, super important. And a lot of these emails, they're spoofed, making it look like it's the CFO or someone in payroll or something like that, and it's being sent to a person that can essentially click the button and send the funds. And then the number of BECs we've seen just in the past couple of years has been astronomical, and they're getting very crafty with the way they route email, using mail rules and making sure that you don't see any part of this entire transaction, but behind your back, they've convinced your coworker into sending $250,000 to an offshore bank account. So definitely some interesting stuff there. Next slide, please. So I think malware is definitely one of the big concerns with everything going on with COVID-19 and the remote workforce, is because, like Joe, like you kind of alluded to this, the fact that you're in an individual's home network is no more secure, or probably a lot less secure than a corporate environment or a corporate network. So a home network is a lot more susceptible to malicious attacks from malware, where your workstation, your laptop may be okay, but you don't know what the desktop computer in the other room is doing. You don't know if it's got AV on it. When was the last time it was updated? Is it still running Windows 7? Things like that. A lot of the things we don't really think about when it's just, our loved ones using it for, play Minecraft or something, or watch YouTube videos, do a couple homework assignments, when in reality, that machine can be used as a pivot into your workstation or your laptop that was even provided to you by your organization. So you definitely want to be aware of threats, and really a lot of the ways to solve these issues is just to stay updated. Update your all the machines on your home network. That includes like the firmware on your router, Windows updates, software updates, application updates. Keep it up to date. And a lot of these updates, they bug you every 2 hours. So it's not even hard just to click install and restart. But typically we just say, postpone for as long as we can. And that's typically where, you create that weak link in your network, and that weak link can be used as a means of, creating more problems in your life. So.
And I think, one of the points you mentioned, Bog, but it was the risk that comes into play with family members. I recently heard an FBI cyber supervisor who talks a lot about his daily work in battling terrorists and hacktivists and other cyber criminals, but in being comfortable dealing with those antagonists. But now that he's working from home, he can't defend his network against his teenage daughters. And so he actually set up 2 home networks, one for he and his wife and one for his teenage daughters, because he wasn't comfortable that he could protect that network that they were using.
Good point. Next slide, please, Eric. So ransomware, I mean, this ransomware, probably preaching to the choir here, but ransomware is something that we've seen an uptick in the past couple of years significantly, even with some of the more vicious ransomware here in the last couple of months. Some of you may be paying attention to that, but, ransomware is now being categorized as more of a breach rather than an incident in 2020 due to how vicious they've become. The last few that we've engaged with, they use things like TrickBot, which some of you may be familiar with TrickBot. It's a Trojan that mutates itself, that replicates itself, that's modular, and it's very, very evasive. And typically when you have ransomware, it's paired with some sort of Trojan that was used to get it on that network and to remain or retain persistence to that network, so that in the event that you go through a week's worth of effort of restoring your backups and doing AV scans and all type of stuff, only to find out that a week later the ransomware is back. And that's something we've seen not too long ago, where an organization was fighting a ransomware attack for roughly 3 months straight, like literally 12 weeks almost worth of, hey, we got hit with ransomware, okay, restore. Where is it? We can't find that. We got hit with ransomware again, restore. They got really good at restoring their data, let's put it that way. And they were very proud of that. But I told them to not be that proud of it, because it's great, but you don't want to be in a position where you're getting so good at restoring data because of a ransomware attack. You want to get good at it because you're testing your backups. But again, ransomware is one of those things where it can be prevented to an extent. You obviously want to have good controls, technical controls in place, updated antivirus, and something like TrickBot is so evasive. With TrickBot, really the only way to stop things like that is to stop it at the start of the chain, and that's at the original phishing email or the original link or download link or something. So some things that you can do is, implementing the principle of least privilege. The amount of times I'll go out on site for incident response and just find out that everyone's using domain administrator accounts, or everyone's using local administrator accounts on all their machines. So one person gets their credentials compromised, and now that ransomware and whoever's controlling that ransomware now has access to their entire network, regardless of how many password changes they make. And that's really the kicker, because in a lot of these ransomware cases, it's no longer just a password change and unplug the computer. Ransomware is designed to dump your password hashes and any related password hashes off the network. And then those password hashes can be used to authenticate with other machines. They don't even need to know your password. And once they're on your network, it becomes, a very huge pain to work with. And, there's obviously some more technical and more logical steps that need to be taken to not only stop the propagation, but also contain it in its place. You obviously want to update software in OS to remove low-hanging fruit vulnerabilities. That's an obvious one. Don't keep Windows 7 and Windows XP machines on your network. Don't keep outdated versions of Chrome and Adobe PDF or Acrobat. Update your stuff. Another huge one is logical and physical network segmentation. This one is one that we don't see very often, and it's unfortunate because in a very flat network, when you have 800 machines and they're all connected together across the country with site-to-site VPNs, yeah, that ransomware will propagate most likely to all of it. And we've seen instances where the ransomware didn't propagate only because the attacker didn't put a flag into the TrickBot Trojan to make sure that it was able to traverse through routers. So they were relying on just broadcast packets and not necessarily relying on actual VLAN IDs to be able to jump VLANs. So this client got off easy, but you don't want to take that chance. Another huge one nowadays you'll see that's being talked about a lot is automated response. And automated response is essentially removing the time of the human element of, hey, I got an alert, I need to log in, I need to go to the office, the drive. All those few minutes is crucial when it comes to an incident response, and you definitely want to be able to, if you have the capability. There's a lot of technology out there. There's a lot of even in-house solutions you can do using things like Windows Task Scheduler and Windows System Center. There's a lot of tools you can use to do it in-house, but definitely recommend it. And an example of this is, for example, you can have policies that are written up that will look for, in the event of a X amount of files being encrypted or their names are changed within a certain threshold of time. So say within 3 to 5 minutes, 500 files. What it does is it turns off the network card and essentially segments that machine off and identifies the machine, segments it off to the side, go in and respond appropriately. And obviously more frequent training. I mean, that's a given. Again, I don't want to beat that too much, but frequent training is very important.
One other footnote that comes to mind is you mentioned the logical and physical network segmentation. I think it's important when we're starting to see a significant increase in issues for organizations because they've lived so long with contracts and contract terms with vendors and customers that address network segmentation, that address network security, and it often talks about physical separation of data. And so while state of the art might not involve physical separation, we see a significant increase in the number of logical or virtual separations of data. It's important to remember that you might have contractual obligations that you want to revisit and revise those contracts if necessary, because technically if you've agreed to terms that require physical separation, that might not be your technical reality, that you're not only your data, but your customer's data and your vendor's data is physically separated anymore.
Yeah, and another point would be, all the new devices that have been added to corporate networks in recent years, thinking of IoT or of the different smart devices or even smart TVs, and separating those out from more of the enterprise equipment. This segmentation can be performed, not only at the physical level, but if it's in a virtualization environment, then you can take the different resources and carve them up into different segments so that it's easy to manage and separate out all of that data. Another impact here is distributed denial of service, with us relying on so many systems for remote access and for company productivity. These systems are certainly vulnerable to attack, but have a great impact to our business. And this is generally something that has been increasing over time anyway, because our reliance on technologies continue to increase just for normal business operations. The addition of new devices and IoT that are giving us new information, but now increasing the impact if those systems go down. And so we also have, expectation, customers looking for even higher levels of availability as they rely on these systems. So what most people are familiar with is the volumetric DDoS attack. and that's where these systems are just flooded with tons of traffic, and they're unable to then service legitimate requests because of all the junk that they're receiving. But there are other different types of DDoS attacks. One is in a protocol where the attacker utilizes some of the functions built into a protocol. In order to communicate over the internet, we have to adhere to certain rules. And so this essentially exploits some of those rules to cause a device to either not accept new connections or to just use up all of the available resources that it has, and then not be able to service additional requests. And then another type of attack is this application attack. And here it's going to request the application to do something that's really computationally impactful or utilizes a lot of storage so that it can be unable to service other requests. Things like tell a database to reindex, or a web application to start searching through all of its information for something using the least efficient method. And so these attacks can look like a normal request for data, but they generate a lot of work. We also see DDoS attacks utilizing different methods of reflecting data. So they'll send one piece of data to a node, and then that node has to reply, let's say 5 times, 10 times. And so they can send data to another machine, and then that machine replies back. But since they'll spoof their address, it ends up replying back to their target. And so they're able to leverage that to produce a lot more traffic than they have in the past. Some of these attacks have utilized some of our underlying technologies for serving up data quickly, and resulted in really they send one packet and 10,000 packets are generated for different types of attacks. It's certainly something that you need to be aware of, and there are mitigation techniques. Some for volumetric include using cloud-based technologies to help absorb some of that traffic. And then in application and protocol, you can adjust some of your filtering controls and some of the way you're developing your application to help protect against utilization of some of these attacks.
Yeah, and I wanted to jump in here and connect some of the ransomware and denial of service that we've been talking about. And just last week, I've been working with a client that had they had a bit of an incident a few years ago, and just last year, and they basically, my point is that once you've been hit, you're a target, and you're on someone's radar. And essentially, what we saw last week was that as we started working on their firewall, they had a very popular brand of firewall, which I'm not going to name, but we started noticing some very strange activity, random reboots, all this type of stuff. We eventually were able to deduce, via the logs and some of the other information we were seeing, is that they were being targeted with a distributed denial of service attack, and a number of those IP addresses that were the source of those attacks were documented in our incident report actually a year or 2 years prior. So you definitely want to be aware of denial of service. They typically aren't necessarily 100% random. There is some sort of purpose behind it. So
well, and that's a good point, because another thing that we see is that there's often a feeding frenzy, right? Whenever an organization has a data breach and they're required to provide public notice or send out notices to individuals about that data breach, they need to be aware that statistically, we see a significant increase in the number of attacks and attempted attacks on organizations immediately after they've made their data breach notification, because I think a lot of the hackers and the criminal organizations perceive that there's some sort of weakness in the security of the organization that they want to try to exploit. So anytime you're in a position where you need to make a breach notification, it's important to be aware that you're probably going to be see a significant number of increased attacks during the period of time right after that breach notification is made.
That's a great, and it can be kind of counterintuitive because people will think, oh, I got hit, so there was my time, and now I should be good for a while. But this isn't, a statistical model. This is real life. And, we've seen it in action where the company was really a target of opportunity, but then once the attacker learned about their environment and really what was there, then they became a targeted attack. And a second attack took place shortly thereafter, now with much more force and intelligence behind it.
Yeah, and that's a good point because, if any of you participants peruse the dark web or the deep web, whatever you call it, there are forums out there, again, coming from particular countries, I'm not going to name, where they share this data, where they'll say that, hey, target A, B, and C, these are the usernames, these are the hashes I've accumulated. Go at it, have fun. I got this type of data out of here. What can you do? And it's a game for a lot of these guys. So definitely be on the lookout.
So we should also talk about unpatched systems. When we do vulnerability scans, one of the big things we'll find is that systems are not patched for applications and software that runs on top of these servers is not kept up to date. This could be everything from Java or the web service version to operating system patches. And those vulnerabilities then leave those systems with a lot of weaknesses that could be exploited by attackers. Here we see the number 60% of data breaches are these vulnerabilities that really could have been remediated had they applied patches. So it's really important to have a robust patch management system in place that's going to apply those patches quickly after their release to reduce the amount of time where those vulnerabilities could be exploited on your network. And to not only just have the patch management system in place, but to have methods to ensure that those patches are deployed and that you don't have machines that are on the network without those patches. If those machines were offline during a patch management window, or if they're recently added, or if for some reason patches deployment fails on those, you want to have an alert to ensure that you can deploy the patches to it once those devices come online or you resolve the issue. And then ways to segment those off and prevent them from connecting to the resources or quarantine them in a way if they don't have all of those patches installed.
And should we also, now that we're in a world with such a significant increase in remote access, shouldn't we probably think about patching more expansively and not think about just the organization's network, but think about all the remote access and the patching that might need to be done on home networks?
Yeah, we have to push this out to all the devices that are connecting to a network. And so that could include machines that aren't owned by the corporation or managed by the corporation. So you have to ensure that those devices meet that minimum security requirement, not only for patches, but for other configuration elements. But certainly in deploying those patches across to those devices, or ensuring that they have those patches before they're allowed to connect to the corporate network. You also have to look at these how you're moving data around the organization. Certainly have 46% of employees saying that they've transferred data between work and personal devices. And now with more working remotely, I think that number is probably even higher. People looking for ways to do work during the pandemic, and they may be transferring data to these devices or to cloud services, but moving data in unconventional means throughout the network. And so the technical control here is really data loss prevention, implementing policies to govern how can data really move around the network, how can it be transferred? Can I email this data? Can I put this onto a thumb drive? Can I dump this to a cloud service? And it will work. Some data maybe I can, and some data I can't. Being able to apply that policy is going to involve, certainly centralized management tools, but also endpoint systems that are going to enforce those policies around the network or even on other devices. If it's bring your own device, so you're allowing personal devices, then we're going to have to extend that to those systems. And then also providing effective methods for us to utilize the data that we have. And some of those methods may need to be changed to the number of people that are working remotely. But having those secure systems in place will help ensure that the users aren't going around and circumventing the organizationally defined systems to go ahead and do their jobs. We want to ensure that they understand here are the methods that are available, and that you have some open communication on other methods that they might want to consider, so that those can be evaluated and to ensure that they are secure and deployed effectively.
And I think that it's important to remember that the transfer of data is under current legal and regulatory regimes is much broader than it used to be. It used to be that the obligations, the legal obligations attached when you store data, and now it's much broader than that, right? So it's important to remember that even if you're not actually physically transferring the storage of data from one location to another, if you're just providing access, technically under most laws and regulations, that access is considered to be a transfer of data as well.
Yeah, good point. Another thing to consider is lost or stolen devices. And you see all the devices we may be using now, and each of those has access to certain corporate information. So got to be able to have a level of control over those devices. This could include, remote wiping them if they are lost, having the level of encryption on them, and two-factor authentication. The passwords are so easily exposed, and there's really a lot of information on all of us that attackers can leverage to try to guess pretty effectively at different passwords that might be used. So having that extra layer of protection on the authentication process with 2FA is going to give you more assurance that employees are who they say they are when they're authenticating to the network. We want to make sure that encryption is extending to all the devices that are accessing the company information. If it's encrypted, then at least you have more assurance that that data is not going to be accessed on the system, and it's protected. Of course, if you can keep the data off the devices in the first place, then that's even better. Trying to restrict what data is sent to the devices or eliminate it if it's not needed, that can go a long way. And I'm moving through some of these slides a little quicker because we are running out of time here. So let's talk a little bit about remote incident response and investigations, and what should we be concerned on here, and what are some of the major steps that we're going to need to take place, especially in the remote working environment. Bogdan?
Yeah, well, if I could interject before Bogdan gets into some of the technical things, it's really important to have a documented incident response plan, right? In fact, most laws require that you have one. And that first bullet point, while it talks about, it can be as simple as a matrix of technical, legal, and HR contacts, you don't want to leave it at that, right? That's the starting point. It's really important to remember with incident response plans that they're living, breathing plans. It's not just a static document that's printed out and distributed to the incident response team. It's important to remember that you need to regularly update that plan based on what you've learned from incidents and or from breaches. In particular, today, what we see is that a lot of incident response plans haven't been updated to account for the significant increase in remote access. It's also important to remember to test that. We do a lot of tabletop exercises, which enables businesses to walk through scenarios that potentially compromise their security, and they practice, in essence, what to do when there's an incident, because it helps identify gaps, right? You don't want to have the first communication you have between your forensics provider or some other vendor be at that point in time when you have your first actual incident. You want to have interacted with them and tested those protocols prior to a live incident. And so it's important to remember that it's a living, breathing document and something that you want to take care to update regularly.
Yeah, and this reminds me of a incident response call we got not too long ago, where I show up on site and I'm like, all right, do you guys have an incident response plan? And the two gentlemen look at me and they're like, yeah, you're it. So, you definitely don't want to be in that scenario. Granted, Yeah, guys like, Joe Dickinson and I and Eric Vanderberg and a lot of the team that we work with, we're there for exactly that purpose. But when you have things outlined, when you have a plan, you are going to be at much more ease as well. And I think that's really the kicker there. Next slide.
Okay. Detection and analysis. So, we can't respond to a breach or an incident or an event if we don't know of it first. And so companies need to be monitoring their systems. This includes collecting information from a variety of devices, endpoints, servers, network devices, all of these pulled together, because something that's detected on one device alone may not really indicate an issue, but when seeing it overall and correlated with other information from the network or from authentication systems like domain controllers or radius server can then provide more information and lead you to detection of an attack. So we want to leverage all these different systems, and it's more than really a human can do. We need to have the technology behind it. And so that really centers around SIEM, data loss prevention down at the endpoints with effective policies, and then either SOC team or people who are going to be working on this. It's a combination of not just the technology, but the humans who together are going to be able to identify what that, what's legitimate, what isn't, and escalate those events or those incidents then to the appropriate people. So you're going to have login enabled, going to have those systems in place, have it all correlated, and then have people who are trained up know what to look for, and have already kind of configured those systems. It takes a while to filter out false positives and get something down that really is effective. And you also want to have all those logs retained so that if you do have an incident, you're able to go back to them and look at it. As new data is revealed on different types of attacks, you may need to go back and look at prior data, see was that ever performed on our network in the past to identify a potential breach.
Yeah, and detection analysis goes hand in hand with containment, because you can't really contain something if you don't even know where it is. And usually containment, we've had people where they're just unplug everything, shut everything down, cut the cables, turn off all the lights, lock all the doors, everything's on fire. Or in most cases, it's safe to just unplug the network interface card, and in majority of cases, that's what you want to do, because you want to keep the machine online, because then that'll give you more information when it comes to the actual investigation, identify and be able to run memory dumps, all that type of stuff, and there's a lot of methods when it comes to remote work and remote containment. There's the ability to perform brief connections and reconnections, which it typically should be a last resort. You definitely don't want to be able to reintroduce the threat to your network. You can use things like a hotspot to pivot the network elsewhere, or you can funnel the outgoing connections from the compromised network to a remote analysis site, which is typically the preferred method. Another way of doing this is to use a sinkhole in your environment, or setting up a dedicated incident VLAN on your environment that's logically separated from everything else and not routed to anything else in your environment. That way, if you're dealing with a lot of virtual machines here with a lot of workstations or virtual desktops, you can just flip the switch and send it all to a separate network. That way things are still quote unquote online, but you have more control over the situation. And then containment, it leads into the eradication and recovery phase. Next slide, Eric. And eradication is really definitely very important. That goes without saying. And you want to make sure first that before you eradicate it, you're creating forensic copies of everything. That way you're not deleting all the evidence. You want to ensure that there's clear attorney-client privilege and work product for all these items, for all the reports, for all the data, the chain of custody, making sure that you have accurate chain of custody, accurate attorney-client privilege for work product, and making sure that, before you start cleaning things, that a lot of these clerical things on the front end are taken care of. And then you just want to, you're making sure that depending on the type of the threat, that you're removing persistent access, you're removing unauthorized configuration access, and you're cleaning malware. And cleaning malware is pretty obscure. Typically, like when you're dealing with something like ransomware, we often recommend, hey, if you can, wipe it, start fresh, because ransomware these days, it does a lot of damage, leaves a lot of indicators of compromise. You definitely don't want that stuff floating around your network, and and we've seen it where it reinfects the network like a time bomb. And then with the recovery, you're wiping hard drives, you're restoring systems from clean backups that hopefully you can validate or clean using various scans, restoring to a mothball machine, and then scanning on there, and just taking those extra steps, extra precautions to make sure you're not reintroducing the threat into your network, which is, again, something we've seen in the past. And then after the recovery, after the eradication, after you've had some time to document these things and work through these items, you jump into the post-incident activities. And Joe, if you wanted to jump into that a little bit.
Yeah, so especially from the legal and the regulatory perspective, it's important that we remember that when it comes to data privacy and cybersecurity, there are two sides to that coin, right? There's what's required by various laws with respect to compliance, and then there's what happens when you have an incident of non-compliance or you have a breach and you're subjected to potential litigation and penalties. And so one of the critical components of post-incident activity is to make sure you pay attention to and document what did you learn, and take what you learned, incorporate it into updates for your incident response plan, updates to your policies, because that will impact the perceived level of culpability the next time you have an incident or a data breach. In fact, most regulators, one of the things that they first ask when they investigate a breach is, tell us about prior breaches or prior data incidents. And then they ask you to tell them what it was that you learned from those breaches and incidents, and that they want to see concrete evidence that you've taken that seriously and you've incorporated those learnings into updating all the relevant documents, into updating or evaluating the efficacy of the technology that you've employed. Regulators don't necessarily look at it as part of their checklist, but it's also important to remember that you might want to revisit your cybersecurity insurance after an incident as part of the post-incident activity.
So we'll quickly skim through some of these next slides here. So supporting remote employees, obviously important, and really one of the biggest recommendations here is if an organization is to offer company issued devices, where these devices have mobile device management. They've got centrally managed antivirus, centrally management, control over that machine, and when that machine is using for work product for work, it's VPNing into a corporate environment or corporate tunnel, organizational tunnel, where even the internet traffic and all that traffic related is going through the corporate network still. That way it's still being archived, it's still being logged, it's still being, there's eyes on it, basically. That way, if there is a threat, you can see that traffic going through your environment, and then you can pinpoint it to the exact machine and device that's in the field or within a remote user. And obviously, you want to make sure that it's got full disk encryption, to prevent from things like theft and losing the device and things like that.
And then also encrypting the data in transit. So when connecting to company resources, utilizing a VPN, or if you're going to do remote desktops that are not over that VPN, then having them encrypted through something like a remote desktop gateway. And then ensuring that your VPN is configured in the most secure way. Split tunneling could allow the resources on the home network to then connect into the corporate network beyond just the machine that's where the VPN client software is installed. So you want to ensure that you're properly segmenting those home systems from the enterprise systems, and even those remote connections may be placed onto another VLAN that has some additional restrictions on it. But implementing all of that is going to help then secure some of these connections coming in. And then Joe, do you want to talk about some of the processes around assessing technologies and such?
Yeah, so I know you, Eric, you and Bart are going to talk about the technical details, but what's important from my perspective is that the law typically doesn't require that you have state-of-the-art, right? Unless you have an unlimited budget, maybe it does. But the reality is the law requires that you understand what technologies and processes you have, that you evaluate those technologies and processes and address shortcomings, that you regularly revisit what you have in place and you actively manage it. But most importantly, that when you think about the documents that you create, the incident response plan, the organizational policies and procedures, website terms of use, it's really important that all that paper reflects your reality. And so when you have technology in place, or when you update technology or acquire improved technology, you need to make sure that the paper that you have in place reflects that reality, because legally you're going to be held responsible for what your policies and your procedures say. So you don't want to be in a position where you have really well-written policies, procedures, and incident response plans, but they're not compatible with what your reality is, your technical reality.
If you're at the IT department in your organization and working with so many different requests, you also want to establish really good communication. A big part of defeating some of these phishing attacks is to establish a method to verify support's identity, so that those who may be subject to some of those phishing attacks will know who's IT and who isn't. Now we want to wrap this whole thing up with some key takeaways. So let's take a look at a few of these. Certainly, we want to protect ourselves, by removing some of the weaknesses that are inherent in our networks and our people. There's the keeping things up to date and training, but also to update our hardware and software. Make sure that it's not just our own devices, but the devices that are connecting into our systems that could be personally owned, that are up to date and meet all those security requirements. Bogdan and Joe, you have some other key takeaways?
Well, for me, the last two bullet points are most important, right? It's important to update your relevant data maps and risk assessments so that they cover the various remote access touch points. And it's also important to remember that many documents, and especially incident response plans, were drafted months, years ago, and they may not adequately address the reality of the remote access that we see today.
Yeah, and really you want to take the time to review and assess the technologies, the policies and procedures you have in place to enable remote access for your employees. Don't just give them a laptop and say, just VPN in or RDP and have fun. Take some effort into looking into the type of encryption you're using, the type of integrity checks, things like that, and obviously update relevant data maps and risk assessments. That way you know where your risks are and how to tackle them.
Well, I hope this has been informative for everyone. We appreciate being able to talk to you today, and thank you for your time.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you all so much. I just wanted to hop on, thank TCDI and Smith Anderson and the gentleman here today so much for a very, very timely and relevant discussion on things that are on everyone's mind. And we really appreciate your sponsorship of today's workshop. We'll follow up with everybody with an email and a recording, and we'll make sure you can get in touch with these folks here with any additional questions. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thank you all so much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.